Hi, this is Literary Devices with Mr. Taylor. First, we'll talk about alliteration, and why not start at the beginning of the alphabet, right? Alliteration means the repeated initial consonant sounds. I say initial because it refers to when these consonant sounds appear at the beginning of each word, as long as these words are close together. And I say consonant sounds because most people would say that the vowel sounds repeated at the beginning of words would actually count as something else, and you'll see that soon. But the consonant sounds don't necessarily refer to the letter, they refer to the sounds. So you could have an S sound produced by the letter C, for example, and that would still count for alliteration. Here are a few examples. Peter Piper picked a peck of pickled peppers. Also, nature's first green is gold, her hardest hue to hold. That's from one of my favorite poems by Robert Frost. A few of these logos, Bed Bath & Beyond, Dunkin' Donuts, PayPal, Coca-Cola, also happen to use alliteration in their brand names because alliteration is catchy. And this one I found ironic, the American Association for the Abolition of Alliteration. So not only is it funny that they're trying to get rid of alliteration and they're almost using it, but they're using something that some people would say doesn't count as alliteration because they're using repeated vowel sounds instead of repeated consonant sounds. Up next we have allusions. An allusion is a reference to another story. I know it sounds like the magic trick illusion that starts with an I, but careful not to get these two confused. Here are a few examples. We'll need to board an ark after school if this rain doesn't stop. That would be a biblical allusion because it refers to a story from the Bible, Noah's Ark in particular. Here's another. He thinks he's such a Romeo with the ladies. That would obviously be a reference, an allusion to Romeo and Juliet. That would be a Shakespearean allusion. And here's another one. She can be such a Scrooge around the holidays. And if you're familiar with A Christmas Carol, then you would recognize the character of Scrooge that we're comparing this lady to. And I love this little picture. Here's Shakespeare saying, "To blog or not to blog, that is the question." Up next we have analogy. And this particular type of analogy, we're talking about how it's used as a literary device. There are other kinds of analogies, but for this purpose, we're talking about a comparison to understand. So here's an example. Defending the kingdom is like a game of soccer, and the castles are the goals. Or you might hear a business executive saying, "We swung for the fences with that marketing plan, but we really hit a home run with our first quarter sales." Both of those happen to use sports analogies to help people understand other things. And here's a funny little one, and also something very important to remember. Passwords are like bubble gum. They're strongest when fresh. They should be used by an individual, not a group. And if you leave them laying around, you'll end up with a sticky mess. Up next we have assonance. This is when you have repeated vowel sounds in words. Earlier when we were talking about alliteration, I told you this would come up. This is when we have those vowel sounds, but they could be repeated at the beginning, in the middle, or even at the end of the word. For example, the rain in Spain falls mainly on the plains, which you might recognize from My Fair Lady. Or you could say the audience met the odd shaman they saw with applause. You could also say Susie swooned over my blue suede shoes. Or the popular button, "I like Ike," from the presidential campaign. Consonance, appropriate that it should come after, is very closely related. Consonance is when you have repeated consonant sounds in words. We talked about alliteration is when you have repeated consonant sounds at the beginning of words, so alliteration is one type of consonance. Here are some other examples with consonants. "Do not go gentle into that good night," which is from a great poem by Dylan. And here is a quote you might recognize if you've seen V for Vendetta. V for Vendetta. "Voila, in view, humble vaudevillian veteran, cast vicariously as both victim and villain by the vicissitudes of fate." Or you might recognize this popular phrase, "The early bird gets the worm." Each of these use that repeated consonant sounds anywhere in the word, beginning, middle, end. Up next we have dialogue, and this one's moving away from the sounds of words and talking about how different characters can interact. This is when two or more characters are talking to each other. Hopefully you recognize this famous sketch from Abbott and Costello. Most people refer to it as who's on first. So, well then, who's on first? Yes, I mean the fella's name. Who? The guy on first. Who? The basement. Who? The guy playing who is on first. If you're not familiar with this, the two are confused because they're referring to a man named Who, and if you haven't seen it, I do highly recommend it. In fact, if you haven't seen it, you now officially have homework. Make sure you check out this sketch from Abbott and Costello. Just as these two are confused because they are not quite communicating on the same page, one of the unique traits of dialogue is you can show how communication works well or communication breaks down, like this example, between two people, between two characters in your story. And then, flashback. A flashback is an interruption by a scene from the past. And here's one of my favorite flashbacks from one of my favorite stories. This is from Harry Potter. And this is where Harry Potter is looking into the pensieve in order to see a scene from the past. "But this is touching, Severus," said Dumbledore seriously. "Have you grown to care for the boy after all?" "For him?" shouted Snape. "Expecto Patronum!" From the tip of his wand burst the silver doe. She landed on the office floor, bounded once across the office, and soared out of the window. Dumbledore watched her fly away, and as her silvery glow faded, he turned back to Snape, and his eyes were full of tears. "After all this time?" "Always," said Snape. And seriously, if you are not familiar with this scene, then you definitely have some homework, because you've got some catching up to do on the fabulous stories of Harry Potter. Up next, we have foreshadowing, which is somewhat related to flashbacks. Flashbacks are when you actually have an interruption and you go see the scene that happened in the past. Foreshadowing has to do with the future, but you don't actually often see the scene from the future. Usually you just have some clues at what's coming up later in the story. For example, in Romeo and Juliet, the fated relationship. Early in the story, before she actually meets Romeo, she asks, "Go ask his name. If he be married, my grave is likely to be my wedding bed." Unfortunately for her, this turns out to be even more true than she realizes. You might have heard your parents say, "You'll thank me for this later." That could also be some foreshadowing. Also, when anybody says, "Think that's bad?" just wait until you hear this. Another great example of foreshadowing. One of my favorite terms, not only to say but to use, would be hyperbole. In fact, hyperbole is without a doubt the single greatest thing in the history of the universe. A hyperbole is an extreme exaggeration. For example, Mrs. Jones just gave us a ton of homework. Well, hopefully you don't need a forklift to get that home if it really does weigh a ton. I haven't had a pumpkin spice latte in forever. Unless you literally haven't ever had one. Most of the time you would just be making this extreme exaggeration. After that, I can never show my face in public again. Hopefully you would still be able to show your face in public again, even if you are embarrassed. Up next, we have imagery, and this can come in many forms, but in general, we're talking about descriptions that appeal to the five senses. Good writers will develop a full sense of imagery to really immerse their readers in a scene. Here are a few examples. The soft tinkling of rain on the window pane lulled me to sleep. A sour combination of cooked cabbage and musty gym socks greeted me at the door. Blinking away the brightness, my eyes took in the splendor of colors richer than I had ever seen. And then we come to good old-fashioned metaphors. A metaphor is an indirect comparison of two unlike things. So we're not directly saying this is like that or this is as that. We're not going to use the words like or as. If you see the like or as in a comparison, then you have a direct comparison. That will be a simile. Here are a few examples of metaphors. My craving for Sonic cheeseburgers blooms every afternoon. We climbed a mountain preparing for this week's test. My heart sang when I brought home a new pair of Converse. Here's another fun one to say, onomatopoeia, and a challenging one to spell at that. Onomatopoeia is the pronunciation of a word that mimics the sound that it names. For example, don't slam the door. I can still hear the dogs barking. Do you dream of the pitter-patter of little feet? Each of those words brings to mind the sound that it's describing. And of course you have your typical examples like boom, smack, crack, hit, splash that you can use. And usually those show up as interjections randomly thrown into sentences or in between sentences. Personification is a lot of fun. Personification is giving human characteristics to something not human. For example, you could say the stairs creaked and moaned with old age. Well, no, the stairs aren't really creaking and moaning like they're old people. We're comparing them to people. The city never sleeps. Well, no city actually ever sleeps, but if you're saying that the city never sleeps, you're referring to the people inside, so you're comparing it to a person. Or you could say the sun smiled down on the park that afternoon. Well, no, the sun does not smile. It's a large ball of gas out in outer space. But we are giving it human characteristics, just like the faces that we give human characteristics to in these houses. Now we come to simile. We mentioned it earlier, but a simile is a direct comparison of two unlike things. Similes will use the words like or as most of the time. For example, this sentence this reference to A Christmas Carol, Marley was as dead as a doornail. Mind you, I don't know what there is particularly dead about a doornail. I might have figured a coffin nail to be the deadest piece of ironmongery in the trade, but the wisdom of our ancestors is in the simile, and I shall not disturb it. Anyway, my future is as bright as the sun. Or you could say, watch Anna move as fast as lightning when anyone offers Starbucks. Up next we have suspense. Suspense is when you feel anxiety or uncertainty about what will happen next. It adds to the mystery and it draws you deeper into a story. Like this quote from The Most Interesting Man. I don't always create anticipation, but when I do, and then he leaves you hanging. There are lots of different ways to create suspense in a story, but here are a few other examples. You could do that through the imagery that you create, like the door slowly creaked open to the empty hallway. Or you could create it through the action, leaving the reader wanting to know what's happening next, like reaching for the slippery edge. Karen didn't know if she could grab it in time before plummeting over the cliff. And it leaves the reader wanting to know what's happening next. Symbolism is when an object represents a larger idea. For example, we take a lot of care of our flags because even though they're just pieces of fabric with some colors on them, they do represent much larger ideas. The American flag stands for everything that America stands for. It stands for freedom and liberty and equality. It stands for all of the people who have fought to defend the honor of the country, and it stands for all of the people who are exercising those freedoms here today, creating a government that is for the people, by the people. Wedding rings are very precious, and it's, of course, going to be a big problem if you lose your wedding ring. Your spouse might be very upset because even though that's just a little band of metal, that band of metal is representative of your relationship together. The ring is a symbol that continuously loops around in a circle like your eternal bond that you guys have together once you're married. Logos from popular brands also work as symbolism. As soon as you see those golden arches, you know exactly what they stand for. Or the Apple symbol, or the Nike swoosh, or the Starbucks mermaid lady thing. And then other status symbols that you use to represent what kind of person you are, or what kind of wealth you have. And here's a funny little cartoon that you want to check out as well. That has been Literary Devices with Mr. Taylor. Thanks for playing along. I hope you enjoyed it, and I certainly hope you got something out of it. Have a great day.